The cold Texas wind whipped across the tarmac of Blackwood Private Terminal, driving a sheet of gray rain against the massive glass windows of the elite hangar. Inside, Garrett Vance adjusted his grip on a heavy wrench, his grease-stained hands moving with precise, practiced rhythm as he worked on the landing gear of a twin-engine turboprop. His worn denim jacket was frayed at the cuffs, and his work boots had seen better days, but his eyes were steady, reflecting a deep, unshakable focus. In the corner of the hangar, sitting at a small wooden desk, his 7-year-old daughter, Chloe, was carefully coloring a drawing of a silver jet. She wore a faded, oversized sweater, her blonde curls bouncing slightly as she hummed a quiet tune. Garrett paused, wiping a streak of oil from his forehead with the back of his arm, his expression softening completely as he looked at her. For the past 3 years, since the tragic accident that had torn his old life apart and taken his wife, Chloe had been his entire universe. He had walked away from everything, fame, accolades, and a career at the absolute pinnacle of aviation, just to ensure she grew up with a father who was always there. The heavy metal doors of the terminal slid open with a sharp hiss, cutting through the quiet hum of the hangar. A group of executives strode out onto the polished concrete, surrounded by a flurry of anxious assistants. At the center of the group was Victoria Montgomery. As the CEO of Montgomery Global Systems, a multi-billion-dollar aerospace and logistics empire, she was widely regarded as one of the most powerful and ruthless executives in North America. She wore a tailored charcoal pantsuit, her dark hair pulled back into a flawless, severe bun. Her face was an icy mask of absolute control, but beneath that exterior her chest heaved with tight, stressed breaths. Beside her walked Preston Holloway, a senior vice president born into extreme wealth, whose arrogant voice echoed off the steel beams of the roof. Preston was gesturing wildly at a sleek, custom-designed private jet parked near the hangar doors. The aircraft's auxiliary power unit hummed, but a flashing amber warning light on the wingtip indicated a grounded system. "We have exactly 45 minutes to clear international airspace, Victoria," Preston barked, his voice dripping with condescension as he checked his platinum watch. "If we miss the signing in London, the board will look for scapegoats. And your entire legacy hangs on this merger." Victoria didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on her 6-year-old son, Julian, who was being led by a stressed nanny. Julian was a frail boy, wearing heavy noise-canceling headphones, his hands trembling violently. The flashing lights and the roaring wind outside were triggering a massive sensory overload. "Find a mechanic now," Victoria commanded, her voice cutting like a razor blade through the hangar. "I don't care what it costs. Get this aircraft certified for departure immediately." The airfield manager, Harrison Blake, rushed forward, spotting Garrett. "Vance, get over here. We have a critical maintenance issue on the Montgomery flagship. Move it." Garrett calmly set his wrench down on his metal cart, wiped his hands on a rag and walked over. He didn't rush. His posture was straight, his shoulders broad, possessing a quiet, masculine gravity that seemed entirely out of place for a line mechanic. "Fix the secondary fuel bypass on the left engine," Preston ordered, stepping directly into Garrett's path. He pulled a thick stack of $100 bills from his breast pocket and slapped them against Garrett's chest. "There is $5,000. You have 10 minutes. Don't look at me, don't ask questions, just do your job, grease monkey." The bills fluttered to the oil-stained concrete floor. Garrett didn't look down at the money. He kept his eyes locked on Preston's face, his gaze so intensely calm and piercing that the wealthy executive involuntarily took a half-step back. "The money belongs on the floor," Garrett said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that carried an unmistakable authority. "And the fuel bypass isn't your problem. Your left engine has a thermal fracture in the primary turbine blade. If you take off, that engine will disintegrate before you hit 10,000 feet. Preston scoffed loudly, throwing his head back in a harsh laugh. "A thermal fracture? You change tires and fill oil tanks, pal. How dare you lecture us on the flight systems of a $90 million experimental aircraft? Harrison, fire this garbage immediately. He is delaying a billionaire's flight with fictional bedtime stories." Harrison Blake went pale, looking at Victoria's cold, unreadable expression. "Vance, you're done. Pack your tools and get off my airfield, now." Before Garrett could reply, a sharp, choked gasp broke the tension. Julian had ripped off his headphones. The young boy's eyes were rolled back slightly, his chest heaving frantically as he collapsed to his knees on the concrete, suffocating in a full-blown, terrifying panic attack. Victoria's mask of absolute corporate power instantly shattered. She dropped her designer leather briefcase, falling to her knees beside her son. Julian, look at mommy." "Breathe, baby, please breathe." Her hands shook violently as she reached for him, but her desperate panic only heightened the boy's terror. The powerful billionaire CEO was completely, utterly helpless. Preston stepped back, cursing under his breath, shouting at the nanny to find a doctor. The entire crowd of executives froze in utter panic. Garrett didn't hesitate. He bypassed Preston entirely, stepping into the center of the chaos. He knelt directly in front of the hyperventilating child, his massive, solid frame completely shielding Julian from the flashing lights of the tarmac and the glaring eyes of the executives. "Look at me, buddy," Garrett said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed an incredible grounding warmth that instantly pierced through the boy's panic. It was the voice of a man who had guided burning aircraft through pitch-black storms. Julian's frantic eyes locked onto Garrett's steady face. "You're a pilot, right?" Garrett asked softly, ignoring the crying billionaire mother beside him. "Pilots need to check their oxygen lines. Put your hands right here on my shoulders. Feel that? We're going to take a deep breath together. In for 4 seconds. Count with me." Victoria watched in absolute, stunned silence as this ordinary, grease-stained mechanic gently took her son's tiny, trembling hands. Within 30 seconds, Julian's breathing began to slow. The wild terror in the boy's eyes vanished, replaced by an immediate, profound sense of safety. Julian leaned his forehead against Garrett's chest, taking a long, ragged breath. "You're safe, pilot," Garrett whispered, gently patting the boy's back before standing up. He turned, his face hardening back into an expression of quiet strength as he looked at Victoria, whose eyes were wide and filled with a rare, raw vulnerability. Garrett didn't say a word to her. He walked over to the wooden desk, picked up his daughter Chloe, who looked up at him with immense pride, and hoisted her onto his broad shoulders. With his old metal toolbox in one hand and his daughter on his shoulders, Garrett walked past the silent, stunned crowd of millionaires, stepping out into the pouring rain without looking back. The heavy silence inside the terminal was broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical clicking of the cooling engine and the sound of Julian's soft, even breathing. He refused to let go of the small silver jet drawing Chloe had dropped, clutching it tightly against his chest as Victoria lifted him into her arms. For the first time in years, the ruthless tech tycoon felt the cold, hard weight of reality. All her billions, her private armada of aircraft, and her global influence couldn't buy her son a single breath of air when his world collapsed around him. But a man with oil beneath his fingernails had done it in seconds, without asking for a dime. Preston Holloway adjusted his silk tie, his face flushed with embarrassment as he kicked a stray piece of paper on the floor. "That was entirely unprofessional," he muttered, trying to regain his dominant posture. "Harrison, ensure that man's credentials are revoked immediately. We cannot have unstable transients interacting with high-profile clients. And get the backup pilot out here. We are losing millions by the minute." Victoria didn't look at Preston. Her eyes were fixed on the rainy tarmac where Garrett's tall, steady silhouette was disappearing into the gloom. Julian leaned his head against her shoulder, his small voice whispering over the noise of the rain. "Mom, where did the pilot go? He knew exactly how to fix the storm in my head." Before Victoria could answer, the cockpit door of the Montgomery flagship opened, and a gray-haired man in a crisp captain's uniform stepped down the air stairs. Captain Lawrence Thorne, a veteran aviator with 30 years of commercial and military flight experience, walked briskly toward the executives. His face was dead serious, stripped of the usual professional cheer. "Madam CEO, we have a situation," Captain Thorne said, his voice clipped. "I overheard the exchange on the ground comms. I just ran a manual ultrasonic scan on the primary turbine of the port engine." Preston laughed dismissively, waving his hand. "Don't tell me you're listening to a fired mechanic, Lawrence. Let's get wheels up." The captain turned a freezing glare toward Preston. "With all due respect, sir, if we had initiated the takeoff sequence and pushed the throttles to maximum thrust, the left engine would have suffered a catastrophic uncontained failure at rotation. Speed. The turbine blade has a microscopic thermal fracture exactly where that mechanic said it was. The entire engine would have exploded, ripping through the fuselage. We would all be dead before we cleared the runway." Victoria felt a chill run down her spine, turning her blood to ice. She gripped Julian a little tighter, her gaze snapping toward Harrison Blake. "Who is that man?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a dangerous mixture of anger and awe. Harrison fumbled with his tablet, his hands trembling. "He's just Garrett Vance, ma'am. He started here 6 months ago. He lives alone with his daughter in a small rental near the old industrial docks. He doesn't talk much. I only hired him because he agreed to work the night shifts for minimum wage." "A line mechanic doesn't diagnose a microscopic internal alloy fracture by ear," Thorne intervened, his eyes wide with realization. "To detect a thermal stress pattern like that without diagnostic equipment, you have to know the exact acoustic frequency of an experimental military-grade turbine. I've only known one man in the entire United States Air Force who could do that. a legendary aerospace engineer and elite stealth test pilot who vanished from the grid 3 years ago. Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs. The corporate shield she had built around herself for a decade was crumbling. She looked down at the silver jet drawing in her son's hand, noticing a small, faint insignia stamped in the corner of the paper, a faded crest of the elite Black Ops aviation unit known as the Knight. Stalkers. Bring up his employment file, Victoria ordered, her corporate authority returning with an intense burning curiosity. I want his background check, his previous employers, his tax records. Everything. Harrison frantically tapped his screen, pulling up the airport's secure database. He selected Garrett Vance's profile, but as the data loading icon spun, the screen suddenly flashed a violent, bright red. A massive, bold warning dialog box locked the screen, accompanied by an encrypted security prompt. Restricted access, Harrison read aloud, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. Level 5 Department of Defense clearance required. Unocran's access will trigger immediate federal apprehension. Preston leaned in, his arrogance finally giving way to a pale shock. What the hell is this? He's a mechanic. How does a mechanic have a classified military lock on a civilian employment portal? Victoria stared at the red flashing screen, her mind racing. She had spent her entire life engineering deals, predicting markets, and controlling people through wealth and leverage. But here was a man who possessed a power she couldn't quantify, a man who had looked at her millions with absolute indifference, and who had saved her son's life while her own inner circle panicked. Cancel the London flight, Victoria announced flatly, turning on her heel toward the terminal exit. But Victoria, Preston shouted, rushing after her. The merger. The board directors are waiting at Heathrow. Let them wait, Victoria snapped, not stopping. Find out where Garrett Vance lives. I don't care what military walls we have to bypass. I am going to see him tonight. Meanwhile, 3 miles away from the elite terminal, in a small, weathered bungalow near the edge of the rushing river, a single warm light cast a glow through a foggy kitchen window. Garrett Vance stood by the stove, his grease-stained work shirt replaced by a clean, faded flannel. He was gently flipping a golden grilled cheese sandwich in a cast-iron skillet. Chloe sat at the small wooden dining table, her legs swinging back and forth as she carefully arranged her colored pencils. Daddy? She asked softly, looking up. Why was that little boy so scared today? Garrett paused, his eyes drifting for a fraction of a second to a small, silver military medal hidden inside an open velvet box on the top shelf of the bookcase, sitting right beside a framed photograph of a beautiful, laughing woman with the same blonde curls as Chloe. Sometimes, sweetheart, people get surrounded by too much noise and they forget how to hear their own breath, Garrett said softly, his voice full of a father's profound warmth. When that happens, they just need someone to help them find the quiet. Did we get fired today? Chloe asked, her innocent eyes holding no fear, only absolute trust in her father. Garrett smiled, a genuine, rare smile that completely transformed his rugged face. We did, Bug, but don't worry. Your dad is pretty good with his hands. We'll find another garage tomorrow. Just as he set the plate down in front of her, the low, powerful rumble of an elite luxury SUV echoed through the quiet gravel driveway outside. The bright, sharp sweep of premium LED headlights cut through the rainy darkness, illuminating the front window of the modest home. Chloe blinked, looking toward the door. Daddy, someone's here. Garrett didn't move. He stood completely still, his posture straightening into that unmistakable, dangerous military stance, his eyes narrowing as he heard the distinct sound of high-end designer heels stepping out onto the wet gravel. The heavy oak door swung open, and the damp, chilly night air rushed into the warm kitchen. Garrett stood tall in the doorway, his massive frame completely filling the space, casting a long shadow across the gravel porch. Standing under the flickering porch light was Victoria Montgomery. The rain had ruined her perfect hair, a few wet strands clinging to her pale cheeks, but her eyes held a fierce, desperate determination. Beside her, Preston Holloway held a large black umbrella, his polished leather shoes caked in mud, a look of profound disgust painted across his face as he surveyed the modest neighborhood. But it was the small figure standing between them that made Garrett freeze. Julian was there, holding tightly to Victoria's hand, his face pale but completely calm. He was still clutching Chloe's drawing of the silver jet against his chest like a shield. You have a lot of nerve disappearing after causing a federal security lockdown on our corporate servers, Preston barked, stepping forward and trying to push his way past Garrett. Do you have any idea the kind of legal firestorm you've started? The Department of Defense just flagged our entire aviation division because of your encrypted file. What are you hiding, Vance? Step back from my door, Garrett said. His voice was low, dropping an octave, carrying a terrifying stillness that made Preston instantly halt his advance. The rain is coming inside. And I won't have my daughter catching a chill because you don't know how to speak quietly in a residential neighborhood. Victoria placed a hand on Preston's arm, pulling him back. Her voice was trembling slightly, stripped of the icy armor she wore in the boardroom. Please, Garrett, we didn't come here to threaten you. Julian wouldn't sleep. He wouldn't eat. He kept asking for the pilot who stopped the storm. I've never seen him connect with a stranger like that. I needed to thank you properly. And I need to understand how you knew about my aircraft. Garrett looked down at Julian. The young boy looked up, a tiny tentative smile forming on his lips. Garrett stepped aside, opening the door wider. Come inside out of the rain. The small living room smelled of melted butter, toasted bread, and pine wood. It was incredibly modest but meticulously organized. Every tool in the small entryway rack was placed at a perfect 90-degree angle. The floorboards were scrubbed clean. Chloe stood by the kitchen table, her eyes wide as she saw the visitors. Hi, Chloe said softly, her natural warmth instantly filling the tense room. Are you the boy from the hangar? Julian nodded nervously, stepping away from his mother and walking toward the table. I brought your drawing, he whispered, holding it out to her. You left it. Chloe beamed, taking the paper. Thank you. Do you want half of my grilled cheese? My dad makes the best ones in the whole world. He puts extra cheese in the middle so it stretches. Victoria watched her son sit down on a mismatched wooden chair next to Chloe. She felt a lump form in her throat. Julian never sat with other children. He never shared. He usually screamed if anyone touched his personal belongings. Yet here he was, sitting in a tiny, working-class kitchen, watching a little girl pull a sandwich apart with absolute fascination. She looked around the room, her high society judgment melting into a profound sense of envy. She had a $60 million penthouse overlooking the ocean, but it had never felt as safe or as warm as this small house. Preston, however, remained by the door, refusing to sit. He paced the small perimeter, his eyes scanning the shelves with calculating suspicion. His gaze landed on the top shelf of the bookcase. He spotted the open velvet box and the silver military medal inside. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the polished metal. What's a line mechanic doing with a distinguished flying cross? Preston sneered, pulling the box down. And look at this. A tactical flight manual from the Edwards Air Force Base Experimental Detachment. This stuff is proprietary government property. Did you steal this when you left the service, Vance? Is that why your files are locked down by the Pentagon? Garrett walked over to Preston. He didn't raise his hands, but his presence was so intensely commanding that Preston froze, his breath catching in his throat. Garrett gently but firmly took the velvet box out of Preston's hand and placed it back on the shelf. You are a guest in my home, Mr. Holloway, Garrett said, his eyes drilling into the executive's soul. You do not touch my belongings, and you do not speak of things you lack the capacity to understand. My past is my own. Listen to me, you arrogant grease monkey, Preston hissed, his face turning red as he tried to salvage his pride. I don't care what kind of decorated history you have. Money rules the world you live in now. Montgomery Global Systems can buy your entire street by tomorrow morning and turn it into a parking lot. We can blackball you from every airport, garage, and hangar from here to New York. You're going to tell us exactly who you are, and you're going to sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding our aircraft's engine defect, or I will personally ensure the police are here within 10 minutes to vagrant you out of this city. Victoria stood up, her eyes flashing with a sudden protective fury. Preston, shut up. But before she could step between them, a sharp metallic sound echoed from the kitchen table. Garrett's old cell phone, sitting next to his toolbox, began to vibrate violently. The screen didn't display a phone number. Instead, a series of rolling cryptographic codes flashed across the display, followed by a single word in bold glowing text. Commander. Garrett glanced at the phone, his face hardening into an expression of absolute, cold gravity. He looked at Victoria, then at Preston, whose arrogant smirk suddenly faltered as he realized the sophistication of the device ringing on the counter. Garrett picked up the vibrating device. He pressed a single button, placing the phone to his ear. He didn't say hello. He didn't state his name. He simply listened as a clipped, distorted voice spoke rapidly through the encrypted speaker, the sound muffled but intense enough to vibrate through the quiet kitchen. Understood, General, Garrett said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion, a stark contrast to the storm raging outside. The auxiliary protocol is already corrupted if they bypass the primary block. Tell them to decouple the hydraulic feedback loop manually. If they try to force the digital override, the tail assembly will shear off completely. I am off the grid. Do not call this line again unless the transponder goes dark. He ended the call, placing the phone back on the counter with a soft click. Preston stared at him, his face twisting from confusion into a venomous sneer. General? You're putting on quite a theatrical performance for a man who lives in a shack, Vance. Who was that? Some old military buddy playing along with your little fantasy. You think an encrypted phone makes you untouchable. Before Garrett could reply, the premium satellite tablet clipped to Preston's belt erupted with a piercing, rhythmic crimson alert strobe. Simultaneously, Victoria's personal phone began to ring furiously, the caller ID flashing the name of her chief aviation safety director at the main corporate headquarters. Victoria answered instantly, her voice tight. "Speak to me." The voice on the other end was frantic, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Madam CEO, we have a catastrophic incident in progress. The Skycrest heavy transport helicopter, carrying 3 of our primary European investors, just encountered extreme localized wind shear over the northern river ridge. The main stabilization software has locked up. The backup systems aren't responding. They are trapped in a low-altitude spiral, losing 300 feet a minute in zero visibility." Victoria's hand trembled, her corporate mask completely disintegrating as she looked toward the window where the black sky seemed to swallow the world. "Oh my God. The investors. The pilots. Can we remotely patch the system?" "We can't," the director shouted over the crackle of static. "The automated safety governor thinks the aircraft has already crashed, so it locked the hydraulic lines. The pilots are fighting a dead stick. They have less than 4 minutes before they impact the canyon walls." Preston snatched the tablet from his belt, his fingers flying across the screen as his face turned a ghostly, sweating white. No, this can't happen. If that helicopter goes down, the London merger is dead, the SEC will freeze our assets, and I am ruined." He turned on Garrett like a feral animal, his eyes wide with a desperate, malicious panic. You knew about the turbine failure on the jet. You just spoke to someone about a hydraulic feedback loop. You know how to bypass the automated safety locks on these experimental military-grade airframes. Fix it. Tell my engineers what to do right now, or I swear to God I will make your life a living hell." Garrett didn't move an inch. He stood with his arms crossed, his quiet masculinity radiating an absolute, unshakable calm that made Preston's frantic flailing look pathetic. "I told your airfield manager that your maintenance protocols were fundamentally flawed 6 months ago. You ignored the warnings because safety margins slow down your quarterly profit delivery. Now the storm is here, Mr. Holloway. Money can't reprogram a locked hydraulic line in midair." Preston rushed forward, slamming his fists onto the wooden kitchen table, completely shattering the peaceful sanctuary Garrett had built for his daughter. Chloe gasped, pulling back into Julian's shoulder, both children staring in absolute terror at the screaming executive. "Listen to me, you pathetic piece of trash," Preston roared, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You are going to save that aircraft, or I will personally call the State Social Services Department before the sun comes up. I've seen your file now, Vance. A single father with no documented income, living in a dilapidated rental with hazardous military contraband on the shelves. I will have your daughter ripped away from you so fast your head will spin. You will never see her again. Do you understand me? Save my company, or I take your child." The temperature in the room seemed to drop to absolute zero. Garrett stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice, but the sheer predatory intensity in his eyes made Preston's breath completely freeze in his throat. Garrett clamped a massive, grease-stained hand around Preston's silk tie, pulling the wealthy executive down until they were nose to nose. The raw, quiet strength in Garrett's grip was terrifying. "You will never speak her name again," Garrett whispered, every syllable hitting like a hammer. "And if you ever threaten my family and my home again, they won't find enough of you to fill a briefcase." He released Preston, pushing him back with effortless force. Preston stumbled against the wall, sliding down slightly, gasping for air, his arrogance completely broken into a whimpering panic. Victoria stepped between them, her hands shaking, tears finally spilling over her cold exterior as she looked at Garrett with a desperate, pleading vulnerability. "Garrett, please," she begged, her voice cracking. "Forget about him. I am begging you as a mother. There are 5 lives on that aircraft. 2 of them are young pilots with families. If you can help them, if you have the knowledge to save them, please, I will give you anything, my company, my wealth, whatever you want. Just don't let them die." Garrett looked past her, his gaze landing on Julian and Chloe, who were holding hands tightly at the table. Julian looked up at him, his small eyes filled with absolute trust. "Help them, big pilot," the boy whispered softly. Garrett took a deep, steadying breath. The line mechanic vanished, replaced entirely by the legendary commander who had never lost a soul under his watch. He walked over to his old metal toolbox, flipped the heavy steel latches open, and pulled out a sleek, black military-grade satellite uplink terminal that had been hidden beneath his wrenches. "Connect me directly to the aircraft's internal comms array," Garrett ordered Victoria. his voice ringing with absolute, supreme authority. "And Preston, if you make another sound, I will throw you out into the mud myself." The sleek black military terminal hummed to life, casting a cold blue glow over the worn linoleum floor of the kitchen. Complex data streams and tactical geographic grids began scrolling rapidly across the high-resolution display. Garrett's fingers flew across the interface with an fluid, unthinking mastery that completely betrayed his simple mechanic clothes. Victoria stepped forward, her expensive leather heels clicking softly against the floorboards as she handed her corporate tablet to Garrett. Her hands were shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. He took the device without a word, plugging an interface cable directly from her tablet into his secure uplink terminal. On the screen, a tiny crimson icon representing the Skycrest heavy transport helicopter was spinning in a tight, erratic circle over a dark, jagged topographical map of the Trinity River Canyon. The altitude readout next to the icon was plunging rapidly. 600 feet, 550 feet, 500 feet. "Establish the voice patch," Garrett commanded, his tone completely shifting. The soft warmth he used with his daughter was entirely gone, replaced by the terrifyingly sharp, absolute authority of a man who commanded elite forces in high-stress combat zones. Victoria quickly tapped a sequence on her phone, bridging her corporate encryption array into his terminal. Instantly, the small kitchen was filled with the deafening, chaotic audio from the falling helicopter's cockpit. The sound of blaring master caution alarms, the roaring screech of fighting wind shear, and the heavy panic breathing of two desperate pilots echoed off the walls. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Skycrest Alpha," the pilot screamed through the static, his voice cracking with pure terror. "We have total hydraulic freeze in the tail rotor. The digital flight computer has locked us out. We are in a flat spin, descending through 400 feet in zero visibility. We can't hold the stick." Garrett hit the transmit key on his terminal. He didn't shout. He spoke with a deep, crushing steadiness that cut right through the screaming alarms in the cockpit. "Skycrest Alpha, this is Vanguard," Garrett said. "Lock your secondary breakers, stop fighting the automated digital system, and listen to my voice." The radio went completely silent for a fraction of a second, save for the blaring alarms. Then a gasp came from the speaker. "Vanguard?" The pilot's voice trembled with a sudden shocked reverence. "The ghost of Edwards? Sir, is that really you? They told us you were dead." "The system thinks we've already crashed, sir. It's locked the manual hydraulic overrides." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. She looked at the man standing in front of her. Vanguard. The ghost of Edwards. She had billions of dollars in aerospace contracts, and she had heard the hushed, legendary rumors whispered by high-ranking Pentagon officials about a mythical Black Ops test pilot who had engineered the military's most classified stealth airframes before completely vanishing from the face of the earth. She looked at his rugged face, his grease-stained jeans, and realized that the greatest aviation mind in human history had been changing the oil on her corporate jets for minimum wage. "Listen to me, Tyler," Garrett said, addressing the young captain by the name displayed on the terminal's manifest. "Your digital flight computer is stuck in an automated safety loop. You cannot override it from the cockpit console. You need to force a mechanical pressure purge. Reach down to your center console and pull the emergency landing gear release handle all the way back while holding your cyclic stick full left." "Sir," the pilot cried out over the sound of grinding metal, "if I pull the emergency gear handle at this airspeed, the aerodynamic drag will rupture the tertiary hydraulic seals. We'll lose all secondary pressure. It will rupture the digital valve seals, Tyler, which is exactly what we want," Garrett replied, his voice an unshakable rock of absolute certainty. "It will bypass the automated computer lock and give you back raw mechanical control of the tail rotor pitch. You have 12 seconds before you hit the canyon floor. Trust your training, son. Pull the handle." Now, seconds ticked by in agonizing silence inside the small house. Victoria gripped the edge of the kitchen counter so hard her knuckles turned entirely white, her eyes locked on the plunging red icon on the screen. 300 feet. 200 feet. Suddenly, a loud, violent metallic pop echoed through the radio speaker, followed by the deep, agonizing groan of a heavy airframe pulling extreme structural stress. "We have the stick," the pilot yelled, his voice exploding with triumphant, tearful relief. "The tail rotor is responding. Pulling up, pulling up. Altitude 150 feet. We have stable hover. We are clear of the canyon walls. Skycrest Alpha is stable." Victoria let out a long, ragged sob, her knees buckling slightly. She caught herself on the counter, looking at Garrett with an overwhelming wave of gratitude and profound awe. 5 lives had just been saved by a man using a piece of equipment hidden in a rusted toolbox. Even Preston Holloway looked up from the floor, his face pale. his mouth hanging open in stunned silence as the reality of what Garrett had just accomplished washed over him. The company was saved. The investors were alive. His entire financial empire had been rescued from the brink of total annihilation by the very man he had threatened to destroy. Garrett didn't celebrate. He calmly powered down the satellite uplink terminal, folding the sleek black screen into the metal box and securing the heavy steel latches. He turned to Victoria, his face an unreadable mask of quiet masculinity. "Your people are safe, Victoria," Garrett said softly. "Now I think it's time you took your son home. It's long past his bedtime." Victoria stepped toward him, her eyes shining with raw emotion. "Garrett, I don't even know what to say. You saved my company. You saved my son earlier today, and now you've saved my people. Money can never repay what you've done tonight. Please, let me help you. Let me bring you back into the world where you belong. You shouldn't be hiding in a place like this." "I am exactly where I belong," Garrett replied gently, his eyes drifting to Chloe, who was sleepy-eyed, yawning as she leaned against Julian's shoulder at the table. "I chose this life because it's the only one that matters to her." Before Victoria could answer, a sudden, powerful vibration shook the glass windows of the small house. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the storm. It was the deep, rhythmic, thunderous thumping of heavy-duty military rotor blades approaching from the east. Garrett's secure terminal suddenly flashed a blinding, high-priority white light across the counter. A proximity warning indicator bloomed across the interface, tracking 3 unidentifiable, high-speed tactical military transport helicopters dropping directly into his gravel driveway. Suddenly, massive, high-powered tactical searchlights cut through the rainy darkness, blindingly illuminating the interior of the small living room through the front windows. A booming digitized voice blasted through a high-output megaphone from the front yard, echoing over the roar of the engines. "Garrett Vance, this is the United States Strategic Aerospace Command. The perimeter is fully locked down. Step away from the terminal and step outside the residence with your hands visible immediately." The blinding white beam of the military searchlight poured through the front windows, turning the modest living room into a stark, high-contrast landscape of long shadows and flashing crimson indicators. The window panes rattled violently in their frames as the thunderous downwash from the 3 heavy tactical transport helicopters flattened the grass in the yard, tearing leaves from the trees and kicking up a storm of gravel against the wooden siding of the house. Preston Holloway let out a sharp, hysterical laugh, scrambling backward away from the window until his back hit the kitchen cabinets. "I told you," he shouted over the deafening roar of the engines outside, his eyes wide with a malicious triumph. "I told you he was a criminal. You thought you were a ghost, Vance? You thought you could steal classified technology, lock down corporate databases, and the federal government wouldn't hunt you down? They're here for you. Harrison was right, you're just a dangerous transient." Victoria didn't look at Preston. Her entire focus was on Garrett. She expected him to run, to panic, or to reach for a weapon. Instead, Garrett stood completely still in the center of the room. His broad shoulders didn't tense. His breathing remained perfectly slow and rhythmic. The terrifyingly intense searchlights illuminated the deep lines on his face, highlighting a countenance of pure, unyielding stone. Chloe didn't cry. She walked calmly over to her father, her small hands reaching up to wrap around his large, grease-stained thumb. She looked out at the flashing military lights with absolute calm, because as long as her hand was in his, the world outside couldn't hurt her. Julian, seeing Chloe's bravery, crept away from his mother's side and stood right next to them, his eyes wide but completely clear of the panic that usually consumed him. "Stay here with Victoria, Chloe," Garrett said softly, his voice cutting through the mechanical roar of the helicopters with that impossible, grounding warmth. "I'm going to go say hello to some old friends." Garrett gently detached his hand from his daughter's grip, walked over to the heavy oak door, and pulled it open. He stepped out onto the porch, completely unafraid of the dozens of high-powered tactical rifles instantly trained on his chest by the elite soldiers, forming a tight perimeter around his front yard. Victoria rushed to the window, pulling Julian against her side as she stared out into the dark, rain-swept night. Through the mist and the glare of the searchlights, a tall, imposing figure stepped out from the lead tactical helicopter. He wore a crisp, dark camouflaged military trench coat, the 4 silver stars of a full general gleaming on his collar. It was General Silas Briggs, the commander of the United States Strategic Aerospace Division, a man whose decisions directed the course of international defense strategy. General Briggs walked briskly up the gravel path, his heavy combat boots splashing through the puddles. He stopped exactly at the base of the porch steps. The armed soldiers stood at absolute attention behind him. Briggs looked up at Garrett, his weathered face breaking into an expression of profound, solemn relief. He took off his military cap, ignoring the pouring rain, raised his right hand to his brow, and delivered a crisp, flawless military salute to the man standing in the faded flannel shirt. "Commander Vance," General Briggs announced, his deep voice carrying over the thump of the rotor blades. "The Pentagon transponder registered your uplink signature 3 minutes ago. We initiated an immediate tactical trace. It's been 3 long years, sir." Garrett didn't salute back. He simply lowered his head in a tight, respectful nod. "General Briggs, you brought a lot of noise to a very quiet neighborhood." Before Briggs could respond, Preston Holloway shoved his way past Victoria and burst out onto the porch, his expensive suit soaked within seconds. "General," he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Garrett. "Arrest this man." "I am Preston Holloway, Senior Vice President of Montgomery Global Systems. This man has illegally compromised our corporate servers. He is in possession of highly classified Department of Defense tracking terminals, and he just threatened my life inside that house. He is a national security threat." General Briggs slowly turned his gaze toward Preston. The sheer, freezing disdain in the 4-star general's eyes made the corporate executive instantly choke on his next word. "Who authorized this civilian to enter a Tier 1 secure environment?" Briggs asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low rumble. 2 armored operatives immediately moved up the steps, grabbing Preston by his upper arms and twisting him away from the door. "Wait! What are you doing?" Preston yelled, his voice cracking with fear as his polished shoes slid through the mud. "We are Montgomery Global. We build your guidance systems. We own the patents." General Briggs stepped up onto the porch, standing directly under the flickering light next to Garrett. "Your corporation doesn't own a single bolt on those aircraft, Mr. Holloway," Briggs said coldly. "Montgomery Global Systems exists because 3 years ago, Commander Garrett Vance engineered the variable cycle turbine core that powers every advanced military and civilian airframe on this planet. Your company was granted the commercial manufacturing license on the sole condition that your safety standards remained absolute, a condition you violated 6 months ago when you ignored his maintenance reports." Victoria stepped out onto the porch, her breath catching in her chest as the final, massive pieces of the puzzle slammed into place. She looked at Garrett, the quiet single father who had been living in obscurity, working for minimum wage to protect his daughter from the chaos of the world. He wasn't a criminal hiding from justice. He was the architect of the modern aviation age, a man who had walked away from infinite wealth and supreme power the moment his wife passed, choosing to be a father instead of a ghost in a government lab. "Commander Vance," General Briggs said, turning back to Garrett with a look of urgent, desperate pleading. "The experimental hypersonic prototype at the Edwards test facility just suffered a complete software corruption during its high-altitude thermal trial. The automated safety systems have locked out the ground control array. The pilot is trapped in the upper stratosphere, and the airframe is tearing itself apart. You are the only person alive who understands the core logic of that digital flight brain. The President has authorized immediate emergency intervention. We need you, sir. The country needs you." Garrett looked back inside the house. Chloe was standing by the door, holding Julian's hand. She gave her father a small, encouraging nod, her eyes shining with the knowledge that her dad was exactly the hero she always believed he was. Garrett turned back to the general, his face hardening into that unmistakable, supreme masculine command. "I'll help you save your pilot," Briggs, Garrett said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "But we fly on my terms. And the first thing we're going to do is strip Montgomery Global Systems of their government credentials." The rain continued to pour, washing away the pristine veneer of the corporate world that had arrived on Garrett Vance's doorstep. Outside, 2 armored military operatives marched Preston Holloway down the muddy gravel driveway. The executive's frantic, high-pitched protests were completely swallowed by the deep, mechanical thrum of the helicopters. His expensive Italian leather shoes slipped uselessly through the dirt, a pathetic sight compared to the elite soldiers who moved with flawless, silent discipline around him. Preston was stripped of his badges, his pride, and his power in a matter of seconds, thrown into the back of a tactical vehicle without a second glance. Inside the house, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy, profound stillness. General Silas Briggs stood near the doorway, his military cap held respectfully at his side, waiting for the commander's next directive. Victoria Montgomery stood completely motionless in the center of the living room. Her hands, usually steady during multi-billion-dollar boardroom negotiations, were trembling slightly. She looked at Garrett, who was calmly walking back to the kitchen table where his terminal remained active. The corporate armor she had worn like a shield for the last decade felt completely useless now. She had spent her life surrounded by men like Preston, men who used wealth as a weapon, who valued people based on their net worth, and who panicked the moment reality slipped from their tight control. But Garrett was entirely different. He possessed a quiet, grounded masculinity that didn't require a title or a massive bank account to command respect. He was a man who had conquered the sky, yet found his true purpose in the simple act of braiding his daughter's hair and making sure she felt safe in a small, quiet home. Victoria walked slowly toward the kitchen table, her gaze soft and filled with a rare, genuine vulnerability. "Garrett," she said, her voice dropping to a gentle whisper that was meant only for him. "I am so sorry for what Preston said, for what I allowed my company to become. I thought I knew how the world worked. I thought power was something you built with contracts and glass towers. I was wrong." Garrett paused, his large hands resting on the edge of the sleek black terminal. He turned his head, his piercing gray eyes locking onto hers. The intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. But there was no anger in his expression. There was only an unshakable, calm understanding. "Power doesn't keep an aircraft in the sky, Victoria," Garrett said softly, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "And it certainly doesn't keep a child safe. You don't need to apologize for the storm outside. You just need to decide what you're willing to protect when the wind starts tearing everything else away." Victoria looked over at the sofa. Chloe had wrapped a small, faded fleece blanket around Julian's shoulders. The two children were sitting close together, looking through Chloe's coloring book. Julian wasn't shaking anymore. The loud roar of the military helicopters outside would have normally triggered a massive, terrifying sensory crisis for her son. But beneath Garrett's roof, surrounded by the man's steady, protective presence, Julian felt entirely secure. He looked up at Chloe, pointing to a drawing of a star, his small face illuminated by a genuine, peaceful smile. Victoria felt a sudden emotional ache in her chest. She had all the money in the world, a global empire, and international fame, but she realized in that exact moment that she had never truly owned peace. This man, living in a modest rental near the docks, gave her son safety without even trying. General Briggs stepped forward, his expression grave as he checked a tactical monitor on his wrist. "Commander, the hypersonic prototype is passing through 90,000 feet over the Mojave. The structural integrity of the wing mounts is dropping below 40%. The automated pilot assist is completely unresponsive to ground overrides. We are running out of sky." Garrett didn't hesitate. The single father vanished, and the brilliant tactical legend took complete control. He sat down at the terminal, his fingers moving with impossible speed across the secure interface. He bypassed the corrupted civilian software arrays entirely, tapping directly into the deep, foundational source code he had authored years ago. "Link the telemetry stream directly to my auxiliary core," Garrett commanded Briggs, his voice snapping with a sharp, absolute military authority. Victoria watched in absolute fascination as the lines of complex glowing data reflected in his eyes. There was no hesitation, no doubt. When everyone else froze under pressure, Garrett became an immovable rock. For the next 20 minutes, the small kitchen became the operational nerve center of a high-stakes rescue mission, taking place at the very edge of space. Garrett spoke into the encrypted headset, his voice calm, steady, and entirely grounding as he guided the terrified test pilot thousands of miles away through a manual system purge. He didn't use overly complicated engineering lectures. He used visual danger cues and simple, precise commands that allowed the pilot to regain mechanical control of the burning airframe. When the monitor finally flashed a bright, stable green, signaling that the prototype had successfully leveled off and was descending safely toward the Edwards runway, a collective exhale filled the room. General Briggs let out a long breath, a deep smile of profound respect breaking across his face. "A perfect recovery, sir," Briggs said, bowing his head slightly. "The Pentagon owes you a debt that can never be repaid." Garrett pulled off the headset, setting it down calmly. The crisis was over, but as he stood up, his eyes immediately found Victoria's. They stood just inches apart in the quiet kitchen, the silence between them suddenly heavy with a deep, magnetic emotional tension. Victoria looked up into his rugged face, her breath shallow, her heart hammering for a reason that had absolutely nothing to do with corporate mergers or falling aircraft. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, General Briggs' radio crackled to life with a high-priority automated message from the local aviation authority that made everyone in the room instantly freeze. "General Briggs," the dispatcher's panicked voice echoed through the speaker. "We have an unauthorized, heavily armed private security transport entering the secure airspace directly above the Vance residence. They are ignoring all military clearance codes and are descending rapidly." Garrett's eyes narrowed into slits of pure steel as a massive shadow fell over the front yard once more, and a sound far more dangerous than the military helicopters began to roar from the black sky. The roar of the incoming private transport split the night, its heavy rotors thrashing the rain into a violent mist. The sleek, unmarked black helicopter dropped aggressively onto the gravel driveway, its high-intensity tracking lights scanning the house. Before the skids even touched the ground, the side doors slid open, and half a dozen men in high-end, corporate tactical gear stepped out, weapons lowered but ready. At the center of the formation stood Pierce Caldwell, the multimillionaire chairman of the Montgomery Global Oversight Board. He wore an expensive wool overcoat, his face twisted into an expression of ruthless, desperate determination. He had flown directly from the corporate command center, intending to seize the experimental satellite terminal and suppress any evidence of the structural failures that threatened his impending billions. "Secure the terminal and remove the line mechanic," Caldwell shouted over the mechanical shriek of his aircraft, gesturing toward the house. "We clear this site within 2 minutes." He took 3 steps forward before the darkness around the perimeter completely erupted. From the shadows of the surrounding trees, heavy military-grade flashbangs ignited with blinding brilliance, followed by the terrifying, synchronized click of dozens of tactical assault weapons. General Briggs' elite soldiers moved with terrifying speed and absolute silence, instantly surrounding Caldwell's private security team. Within 5 seconds, the corporate operatives were forced to their knees in the mud, their weapons stripped away by men who fought in the world's most brutal combat zones. Caldwell froze, the color draining from his face as the blinding searchlights of the 3 military transport helicopters swiveled, pinning him in a crossfire of pure, white light. General Silas Briggs stepped off the porch, his long camouflage trench coat snapping in the wind as he walked down the gravel path. Behind him came Garrett Vance. Caldwell looked at the 4 stars gleaming on Briggs' collar, then his eyes drifted to the tall man standing beside him in the faded flannel shirt. His breath caught in his throat. As a defense contractor, Caldwell had seen the top-secret portraits locked within the Pentagon's most secure archives. He recognized the piercing gray eyes, the unshakable posture, and the quiet, dangerous aura of the man who had single-handedly designed the core architecture of global aviation. "Commander Vance," Caldwell stammered, his knees trembling as the reality of his situation crashed down upon him. I didn't know you were the one on this site. We were told an unauthorized civilian was compromising corporate assets. You came into a Tier 1 secure military zone with an armed corporate militia," Pierce, General Briggs said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm, icy register. "That isn't corporate leverage anymore. That is high treason against the United States." Garrett walked down the steps, stopping right in front of the wealthy chairman. He didn't raise a hand, but his quiet, masculine gravity seemed to crush the remaining air out of Caldwell's chest. "You risked the lives of 5 people tonight to protect a profit margin," Garrett said, his deep voice carrying a resonance that made the corporate titan look incredibly small. "And then you brought weapons to a place where my daughter sleeps. You are done, Pierce. Your patents are revoked. Your assets are frozen. You will spend the rest of your life answering questions in a room with no windows." With a simple wave of Briggs' hand, the military operatives lifted Caldwell by his arms, dragging him back toward the transport vehicles along with Preston Holloway. The 2 men who had entered the neighborhood believing their money made them gods were escorted away in plastic zip ties, completely broken and facing absolute ruin. The heavy clouds began to break, parting to reveal the first soft golden rays of a Texas dawn. The storm had finally passed, leaving the morning air crisp and clean. The military helicopters spun down their engines, returning a peaceful, profound quiet to the valley. Inside the house, the small kitchen was filled with a warm amber light. General Briggs stood by the door, offering a final, respectful salute to Garrett. "The aircraft is secure, sir. The Pentagon will monitor the restructuring of Montgomery Global under Victoria's sole authority. We will await your call when you are ready to return to the skies." "Thank you, Silas," Garrett replied softly, returning a slow, dignified nod. The door closed, and the house became entirely silent. Victoria stood by the counter, watching Garrett walk back into the room. She had changed out of her severe corporate jacket, wearing a soft gray sweater she had found in her vehicle. Without the armor of her status, she looked entirely human, her dark eyes shining with a rare, peaceful warmth. Chloe and Julian were curled up together on the sofa, fast asleep beneath the faded fleece blanket, their breathing perfectly synchronized. Julian's small hand was still resting gently over Chloe's drawing. Victoria walked over to Garrett, stopping just inches from him. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched the rough, calloused skin of his hand. I spent my whole life believing that the only way to protect my son was to build a fortress of money and power, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. But tonight I realized that true safety isn't built with steel towers. It's found in the heart of a man who knows exactly who he is, and who loves without any conditions. Garrett looked down into her eyes, his steady gaze softening completely. He wrapped his large, warm hand around hers, his grip solid and comforting. You don't have to run anymore, Victoria. The storm is over. You and Julian have a place where the noise can't reach you. A beautiful, unforced smile broke across Victoria's face, the last remnants of her icy corporate mask completely melting away. For the first time in her life, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She didn't have to lead, she didn't have to negotiate, and she didn't have to be afraid. She was just a woman standing in a warm kitchen, looking into the eyes of the man she knew would protect her for the rest of her days. Through the window, the sun rose higher into the sky, illuminating the small wooden desk, the neatly arranged tools, and the two children sleeping peacefully on the couch. They were two different worlds brought together by a single act of quiet strength, bound by an authentic love that no amount of wealth could ever buy, ready to build a beautiful, unbroken future together.